We're going to cover the basics of how to write a reader response assignment in this video today. So first of all, what is a reader response? And a reader response can look like many different things depending on if you're being asked to write an essay or just a short one-page response in a class or a short answer on a test. But basically, you are being asked to make meaning of some type of source. Usually it's a text, although it could be a video or a song, something like that. And objectively, you need to understand what it's trying to say. And then you're also being asked to connect that to personal meaning. So on the subjective side, what that means to you. So you have the text itself that you're covering and then your interaction with that text. At its heart, a reader response requires two things: that you are providing information about the original source. Usually that comes in the form of summary, summarizing information and points from that text, description of what's going on in that text, and or specific examples from that text to support your response. And then explanation of your response. So not just how you're responding, but why. And you should assume that your reader has not read the text, that they have no experience with what it's about, so that you provide enough context so they understand what you're trying to say. Because information without full context leaves the reader kind of floating and they don't know what you're talking about and why. And lastly, there are no real right or wrong responses to a text. However, there are underdeveloped or not well supported responses to a text. So for example, if you're not providing enough explanation and examples to support your response, or if you're misinterpreting the original text, that can cause problems in your response. So let's do a little bit of practice here. We're going to be looking at a music video, which is a little bit easier to start with because there's wording, there's sound, there's images to look at, all things that you can dive into with your response. The link is provided here, and we're just going to hear a quick clip of it, and then I have the lyrics written down that we can look at line by line. So that was just a very short excerpt from the entire music video. I encourage you to go watch that so that the following here will make a little bit more sense. However, you could look at just the lyrics and be able to have responses to that as well. All right, so the first bit here we have, if you can't write in the proper way, if you don't know how to conjugate, maybe you flunked that class and maybe now you find that people mock you online. Okay, now here's the deal. I'll try to educate you, gonna familiarize you with the nomenclature. You'll learn the definitions of nouns and prepositions. Literacy is your mission, and that's why I think it's a good time to learn some grammar. Now, did I stammer? Work on that grammar. You should know when it's less or it's fewer, like people who were never raised in a sewer. So what's going on here is you have a song that was originally written and sung by somebody else, and you have Weird Al, who's known for his eccentric songs, going and taking the music and changing the words to a different topic. And so he's being playful here, he's kind of picking on the audience, but it's with the goal of teaching better grammar. And here we have another stanza talking about the phrase "I could care less" and how we use that incorrectly because it should be "I could not care less," unless you do care at least a little. And then we have another stanza talking about ITS versus IT apostrophe S, which is the difference between the possessive form of the word and a contraction, and that we don't use it correctly in a lot of cases. The next stanza, you have no X in espresso. And then the Oxford comma is a fairly well-known rule that when you have at least 3 items in a list, you put a comma before the last item on the list and the conjunction. So item, comma, which is Oxford comma, and the last item. And then we have another stanza talking about texting and social media lingo where we use abbreviations. So instead of writing the word BE, we'll just write the letter B. And we use those to try to save time, but when they're not used in the appropriate context or setting, people might not know what they mean. And also, even if they do know what they mean, they might not just be appropriate. Then we have we have a refrain and another stanza here, bringing up the example of to who and to whom, which is so misused in the American English language that in America we've pretty much given up on to whom, the objective form of the word, and we just use to who for everything. And I would actually argue that that's a shift in our language now, and we just say who for everything so that we don't accidentally use whom incorrectly. And I think that's going to be a permanent shift, and it's one big difference that you'll notice if you were comparing other dialects of English, like British English. And it says never use quotation marks for emphasis, although again, you see that quite often in people's writing. Knowing the difference between doing good and doing well. And then finally, one of my favorites, because I had a problem with this when I was in, I can't remember if it's middle school or high school, but the difference between literally and figuratively. And we knew we weren't saying literally meaning actual truth, but we would use literally to emphasize everything. So I'm literally too tired to do this or that. Literally, the car is, so low on gas. We're literally gonna run out of gas, and probably not in those situations. It was just for emphasis. Then we have another stanza about grammar in emails, another stanza about why we need to use proper grammar, and then the final stanza where he's given up teaching us better grammar, which I feel is pretty authentic in that if you're trying to teach perfect grammar to people, we have a very low tolerance for that, and generally you need to give people some allowance for grammar usage and realize that it changes over time and it's not always static and a hard and fast rule that we can follow. So, what is your response? So, ideally, you should read the text several times, or if it's a music video, watch the music video several times. And if there are any big concepts or vague or confusing concepts, you should try to figure those out and understand what the author or creator is talking about. For this particular video, you can ask yourself, what's going on in this music video? What is Weird Al's message? Keeping in mind that it is a parody song, and that's a genre that has a real specific purpose that may be independent from the message. Do you agree with his message? Did you support his argument? Did he provide good examples? What didn't you understand? What did you take away from the music video? What did you like or dislike? And do you have any personal experiences or connections to this? And the reason why you want to slow down and ask yourself these types of questions is so that you can really figure out what your response is. We have initial gut reactions, but you really want to sit down and explore what your response is to something and ask yourself a bunch of questions, kind of breaking it up into pieces. For the purpose of talking about reader response as a genre of writing in academia, we can talk about different categories of response, so different things that you're trying to do. And sometimes it's clear what category of response an instructor is looking for. Sometimes it's not clear, or sometimes you get to choose. But some basic ways to break down what you're doing with your response, you can look at these 3 categories. So first of all, we have identification of your personal reaction. This is kind of the easiest, most gut reaction that you can have to a text or a source. And that's looking at 2 different things. You can look at what you understood versus what confused you, and that can just demonstrate comprehension, and sometimes that's what instructors are looking for. And you could also look at what's interesting you or disinteresting to you, or what you liked versus what you didn't like. And that's just kind of a gut reaction that you're saying, I'm having this reaction, here's why. The next level up would be self-reflection, where you are looking at the content of the source and you're trying to make connections to your personal experiences, to your life. And the last category we have here is analysis. So evaluating the writer's ideas or arguments and bringing yourself into that evaluation. And then the other option here, agreeing versus disagreeing with their message. So it doesn't necessarily mean they have to have an argument, but you can agree or disagree with their message or parts of their message. If you were going to look at the complexity of what you're doing with these different types of categories of agreement, you can look at this pyramid here. On the bottom is the most foundational, understanding something versus having something be confusing, having interest versus disinterest, then reflection or connections to your experience getting more difficult. More difficult than that, evaluating the writer's ideas and arguments. And lastly, agreeing versus disagreeing with their message. And the techniques here that you need to use for these different types of categories, again, analysis, which is more complicated than self-reflection, which is more complicated than simple identification of the way that you're feeling. So we have examples here for each of the different categories of response, and we have a working thesis statement that could help kick off the development of an essay, and some example main points that could be used in creating an outline or working on a draft of an essay. So for understanding something versus what's confusing, an example thesis statement could be, I was confused by some of the examples Weird Al used in his music video Word Crimes, which suggests that I am part of his intended audience. And then the development of that in the body of the essay would bring up the example of how to conjugate verbs, if that was a confusing topic or you struggle to conjugate verbs. Diagramming sentences, which I actually dislike, so I'm never surprised when people say that they don't like or understand diagramming sentences. And he brought that up as a way to learn grammar better, which I don't know if I can necessarily agree with that. Works for some people, doesn't work for others. The example of the subjective who versus the objective whom, and the dangling participles piece of grammar. And so you would spend time explaining what was confusing about those concepts and why. The next example here is the interest or disinterest, or the like versus dislike. So we have the working thesis statement. I enjoyed Weird Al's Word Crimes video because it made use of parody to poke fun at written communication flaws in our society. And some main points to develop that is that this, is a typical fun Weird Al parody of the Robin Thicke song Blurred Lines. I actually prefer Weird Al's lyrics to the song, partially probably because I was an English major, but And then it pokes fun at the audience without being too mean, almost crosses the line sometimes. But basically, particularly the examples that give common but bad grammar habits and errors, and the few versus less, social media and texting abbreviations, and its versus its as specific examples of those. Reflection and self-connection example, working thesis statement. I can sympathize with the frustration demonstrated by Weird Al in his Word Crimes music video as an English instructor. However, I can also sympathize with people struggling with grammar rules because I wasn't always a strong reader or writer. And some main points we could have in the paper that I could bring up. Confusing grammar rules in the video that he mentions, the dangling participles, the who versus whom that people struggle with, and that he has some ineffective recommendations for teaching grammar. So for example, in the video, he recommends diagramming sentences, which again, works for some people, doesn't work for other people, didn't really work for me in learning grammar. And then also, I link that experience with grammar worksheets as well as another tactic that didn't really work for me. However, I do think a fun, catchy song about grammar is useful, and it would have helped me learn some of the things that he brought up. The evaluation example here, the working thesis statement. In his video Word Crimes, Weird Al does a great job of supporting his argument that society needs to work on its written communication by providing relatable examples. And so those relatable examples that he's providing, I want to bring those up in the main points. So less versus few in the grocery store checkout example. I actually didn't even notice this until well after college that I was like, hey, wait, that's not right. Even though it was something I would see at least on a weekly basis in my real life. Literally versus figuratively, I'm guilty of this too. I have to make an effort to not use literally figuratively. The who versus whom, that one I agree it's a grammar rule, but I disagree in its importance of using whom because I think it is disappearing from the dialect of American English. And then texting and social media abbreviations, again, yes, we use them, and as long as the audience understands what we're trying to say and we're using them in appropriate situations, that's fine. But the problem that he's pointing out, I agree with, that we don't always use them with the correct audiences or in the correct situations. And finally, we have the example of agreeing and or disagreeing with parts of the messaging or argument. Working thesis statement, I agree with Weird Al's Word Crimes video overall premise that our society should become better written communicators, but I disagree with some of his specific examples. And then main points, popular usage of who versus whom. Again, I think that's falling out of use in American English, for better or worse. We've already done it with other pronouns. I also feel like he gets close to crossing the line with some of his, calling out the audience as a mouth breather or a clown or a 7-year-old or stupid or spastic. I know it's all in fun and people aren't meant to identify too closely with the audience that he's talking to, but again, it's bordering on getting to be too much. The BCRU abbreviations, again, when people are using texting and social media abbreviations in the wrong context or with the wrong audience, yes, I think that's a problem. But if you're using them in those contexts with audiences who understand what those abbreviations are, they actually save time. And so I feel like that's just fine for a usage. And then lastly, the threat of violence for confusing literal and figurative. Again, it's playful, it's supposed to be in fun, but the example of smack a crowbar upside your head, again, getting close to crossing a line from fun to like a little bit too close to the truth. And so you would pick one of those types of response and one of those working thesis statements and set of main points, and then you would want to turn that into an outline in most cases to prepare to draft the actual essay. And I have an example here of what the response essay structure or outline can look like. And so again, you have your introduction, always need that with a formal essay, not needed with shorter written responses or test questions, but for an actual essay. Must have an introduction that grabs the reader's attention, introduces the source that you're working with so your reader knows what you're talking about, and ends with a thesis statement that is your overall response summarized in one sentence. Then it's popular for people to spend the first body paragraph doing a summary of the original source. So it's just a high level one paragraph summary of what you're summarizing or what you're responding to, so that your reader has context for the information that follows. That is optional. Some people just jump right in to their first point, their first response. Then you want to make your first point about your response, and then your second, and then your third. And each body paragraph has to be different. You can't just be reiterating your same response to everything over and over again. You want to explain parts of your response and then provide examples from the source, and then provide enough explanation so that your reader understands why those examples support your response, justify your response, develop your response, and so on. So typically about roughly 50% of an essay that is response would be summarizing or providing information about the original source, and 50% would be focused on the response of the writer. So roughly a 50-50 division. And then finally, you end with your conclusion, where you will restate your thesis statement, but in different wording. It can also be a deeper investigation now that you've provided all of your main points, so you can be more specific with your restated thesis statement. Then provide a summary of your main points, and finally, an interesting way to end the essay without introducing any new points. And I just highly recommend the conclusion be from the perspective of, if your reader was not going to read any of your essay except for the conclusion, what do they absolutely need to know in that one paragraph? All right, thanks for listening.